At $200, a Super Nintendo setup costs twice as much as the old system. For the money, the company promises better pictures, sound, and adventure. Now you're playing with power, superpower. You're the king, I tell you! The king!
Only for Super NES.
Only on Super NES.
You're listening to the SNES podcast with your host, Soulblazer.
Hello, everybody. This is Super NES Podcast, episode number 256. I am Greg, joined always by Joe.
Hello.
And we actually did not time this out this way, but actually, I didn't time this out this way. Maybe Joe did the back of his head, but we actually strike them with irons hot per se by covering two wrestling games this episode, recording right after a big weekend in wrestling that happened. So some very nice symmetry going on here.
Yep.
These were kind of sort of both our picks. It's like, Joe's the big wrestling fan here. I throw wrestling games every now and then as bones because to make up for some of the picks that I want to do that for games I know he's not very keen on, but I don't think we arranged the timing of this the schedule on purpose like this either, Joe.
No, I don't think it just happened to fall that way when we were planning the games.
So to give a small bit of context, there are three wrestling games Super NES, which are also sometimes referred to as a 16-bit LJN WWF Trilogy, because LJN LJN/Acclaim was the publishers of these three games because they had the license to wrestling games during this time period of the 90s. So those three games being Super WrestleMania, Royal Rumble, and Raw. And we cover the middle game of this trilogy, Royal Rumble, way back when, episode 53, like some 6 years ago, with George, when George was also a big wrestling fan, was the co-host with me on this podcast. But we never got around to covering the other two games. So, in hindsight, we probably should have covered all three games in the same podcast, but we didn't for whatever reason. So, we rectifying that error now by covering the other two wrestling games like this trilogy, Super WrestleMania and WWF Raw. So, anyway, Joe, you probably have experience with both games and Genesis version of them, I'm assuming?
So, yeah, my experiences with the Genesis game. When writing notes for the Super WrestleMania game, I did mention the differences because I felt that it was needed to be mentioned, but as far as Raw goes, they're almost identical to a point. There's just too many versions of Raw to sit there and talk about all the differences between every different version, whereas like with Super WrestleMania, it's actually pretty striking how they differ.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
We're going to get all Yep. So, and that's probably going to be spoiler. That's probably going to be the bread and butter of our conversation because these games are not really all that deep because they're grapple style wrestling games. It's what do you expect? So, but yeah. So yeah, it is fitting. It is fitting that we're covering these games right after big. Probably the biggest weekend of wrestling this year. Even me, not being a wrestling fan, heard plenty of wrestling talk, online and social media presence over this weekend. And I guess pretty positive impressions and full of surprises, like what people are telling me. So I guess it was a pretty good weekend.
Yeah, it was a pretty good weekend. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't like the best that there's ever been either. So, it was serviceable.
Well, this has been around for professional wrestling's been around for 30, 35 years now at this point. So it's like that's a pretty high bar to set. So.
This was WrestleMania 41, so yeah, 41 years.
Well, wow. Yeah. Wow. I hadn't even realized it was that long.
Yep.
But, anyway, so So let's go over the basic details about both games here. Both these games, as well as the Royal Rumble, were developed by Sculpture Software, a company we've talked about before in the past, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. But Sculpture was a pretty good developer back in the day. They did, they're probably best known for they're probably best known for doing Super Star Wars games. They also handled Super NES ports of Doom, Mortal Kombat, all 3 Mortal Kombat games actually, 1, 2, and 3. They did have like a pretty good staff. So, their last game actually was the Legends of Wrestling's game, by the way, which ended up going over to Acclaim Studios Austin after the company got closed down. Yeah. So they finished on wrestling too. So it was kind of funny, but, So Super Wrestlemania was the first game of the trilogy to come out. 1992 for its North American and European releases on both Super NES and Genesis. Not a surprise, these wrestling games never got released like Japan. Until recently, Japanese wrestling games were Japan only, and Western wrestling games were Western only. It's only been in recent years that those walls have come down per se. We can get wrestling games of some other country, like in your country probably. So. Because Japanese wrestling, as we talked about before in past podcasts, was very different than like what we see here in the States. Yep. But this was a pretty iconic game when it came out. It was pretty big. It was pretty big. It was anticipated because it really is just an improved version of WrestleMania for the NES, which also was a very popular game. This game was advertised very heavily. I remember there was an issue of Nintendo Power that featured this game on its cover with the famous picture of like Hulk Hogan doing his like rip shirt off thing. But for them to put this game on its cover shows you how much hype this game had behind it when it came out. Yeah. So this was a very popular game. Did you have this game as back in the day, Joe, or did you play it at friends' houses, or what was your experience with it?
No, so my wrestling game growing up was WWF Steel Cage Challenge for the NES, which is not a good game, but also that is the link from the NES to what we got here with Super WrestleMania.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I eventually got Super WrestleMania for the Genesis.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, I'll tell you right now, spoiler, Raw is the best of the 3 games.
It's the last game to release. That's to be expected, yes, but...
Yeah. So, needless to say, by the time I got Super WrestleMania, Raw was out, and I think it wasn't even like a month after I had gotten Super WrestleMania, because I got it for my birthday. I rented Raw, and that was the end. I ended up buying Raw with my birthday money and never looked back for Super WrestleMania. Right. So it is what it is.
So yes, no, I think that's fair. It's like Super WrestleMania is definitely a game that probably I don't think this is controversial. It was very popular and very hyped when it came out, and the eBay prices reflect that. But the game clearly is the weakest of 3 games, and clearly is the game that's not aged has not aged the best. Especially Super NES version because as Joe teased earlier, I don't know why, but there are significant differences between the Super NES and Genesis versions of this game, and this is definitely a case where the Genesis version I think is its superior version. With the 2 games, Super NES version does feature very nice graphics. That title screen is still like pretty damn good even by today's standards. Yeah. So the graphics of the game are definitely very pretty. For sure. So, the sprites are large, like well detailed. The font is very readable. The font they use, the taunts and whatnot, like very readable. The gauges simple to see. The sound effects and the music in this game are pretty good. They're like typical wrestling style stuff, I thought. But the Super NES version of the game, let's talk about what it does. Let's talk about vis-a-vis the two versions of the game. Genesis version of the game features signature moves like for a wrestler, which I don't know why they're not included in the Super NES version of the game, but they're not here. Both games do have the same standard professional wrestling moves that you'd expect, like scoop slams, super suplexes, drop kicks, hip tosses, etc. You can have the gameplay modes for this game are either like 1-on-1, tag team, or Survivor Series, and you can do either one player versus a computer or two players. With these options. The Survivor Series is well, you probably could explain Survivor Series better than I could, Joe. So
Survivor Series is essentially a 4-on-4 tag match, where once you pin your opponent, they are eliminated from the matchup. So you could easily get into a situation where it is 4-on-1 or 1-on-4, as an example. I think the Genesis version was able to get those finisher moves in because of the fact that they cut a couple wrestlers.
True, yeah. So
I was going to say that we'll get into this. So the Super Nintendo version, it was clearly the flagship version, because they wanted to make sure they had all the good guys and bad guys that were hot at the time. We got Hawk and Animal, you got Earthquake, obviously Hulk Hogan, Jake Roberts, Randy Savage, Sid Justice, Ted DiBiase, you got Typhoon, and The Undertaker. And all the sprites are, decent size, they're well detailed, you can see who these wrestlers are. In the Genesis version, we have only 3 characters that carry over from the Super NES version, being Hulk Hogan, Ted DiBiase, and Randy Savage. And here they included Shawn Michaels, Papa Shango, Erwin R. Shyster, and British Bulldog, and then Ultimate Warrior. And then, of course, you get those finishing moves. So I want to say it probably had something to do with maybe the room that the detailed sprites took on the cart.
Could be,
which
maybe.
is why, the finishing moves weren't included. And I really can't, say in detail that is the case, but the fact that finishing moves do show up finally in Raw for the Super Nintendo makes me believe that might be the case. But
it's a very good plausible reason for sure. So
yeah, and I think like I said, I don't know the technicals behind it, but I have a feeling that Raw was a bigger RAM cart, so
I'm sure it was.
Makes sense that they were. So that makes sense that would be included in the later version and not this early version.
Yeah. So popular opinion online seems to be that the popular opinion online seems to be that people prefer the roster of wrestlers in the Super NES version over the Genesis version. That they thought the Super NES version had the quote unquote bigger name wrestlers included with it. But the Super NES version is also missing. There's also missing the championship mode. The Genesis version has, again, for some reason I don't know. It could be like space reasons. So it's like there's definitely pros and cons of both versions. I think personally, I think the Super NES version looks prettier, handles a bit better. I think compared to the Genesis version, has arguably the better rosters. But the Genesis version of the game feels more fun to play because it has those missing finishing moves in it, because it has the missing championship mode that they can play by. I guess it depends upon what you're looking for. If you want the wrestling experience from this game, the Genesis version I think is a more complete, well-rounded game to play. If you're looking to play as a certain wrestler who's popular at this time period, the Super NES version I think arguably has the better roster and looks prettier and handles better than Genesis counterparts. I think it really comes down to a matter of personal taste. That said,
I was going to say that's being generous because gameplay is sadly like mindless button mashing.
I was getting to that. Yes.
They did introduce the tug of war system with this game, which will of course play big time in the two sequels, Royal Rumble and especially Raw. Like here you get the tug of war system, but there's no gauge for it, so it really is like whoever can mash buttons quicker is going to get the better end of that exchange. And all the wrestlers, like, their moves are cookie cutter. You could pick anybody. They're going to have the same moves. They all play the same. Again, something that Raw rectifies down the line. But yeah, here it's a very basic game. And
yes,
like I said, game is lightly used because of the fact that it is a button masher. And that is the one thing I do remember about this game, is it was all about who could basically break their controller first.
Yeah, exactly. Like you know, like I said before, this game does not age as well as the other two wrestling games, unfortunately. But not the game's fault, because like I said, the game really was well hyped when it came out, and the game sold very well. It got positive reviews. Just to give you some contemporary magazine scores. For example, computer video games gave it like 90 out of 100. Game players gave 7 out of 10. Game fan 160 out of 200. Game Pro gave it 17 out of 25. And Nintendo Power gave it 14.2 out of 20. So, like, pretty good scores across the board.
Yeah.
But for when it came out, it was a top-notch wrestling game. Now, over 30 years later, of course, Joe just talked about like all the flaws the game has. I'm just saying, I think the only reason to play this game nowadays would either be to check out these older games for whatever reason, or if you're a big fan of one of the wrestlers featured like this game, who may not have been included in later games for whatever reason. So,
yeah.
But what they did here was important because it established the groundwork to make the follow-up games. This definitely made Royal Rumble a better game. This definitely a game which also in turn made Raw a better game for sure. So I think you can't have better games with better games like something coming out first. So
yeah,
Super WrestleMania was very groundbreaking, like for day and age for sure. But like nowadays, it's like. Yeah, it's a very simple game for sure. So it's hard to recommend unless you're playing for one of the reasons that I already stated.
Yeah, so one of the things I point out with the lineage is like the example was Super Mario Brothers. So the original Super Mario Brothers is, I mean, granted, it's a classic. There's no getting around that. But if you compare the original Super Mario Brothers to Super Mario Brothers 3, it's almost like criminal to compare the two games because of such a gap in advancement in technology and the fine-tuning that was done to get to Super Mario Bros. 3. It's the same thing here. It is really criminal to compare Raw to Super WrestleMania, but you have to, because Super WrestleMania is what laid the foundation and sets up what was, spoiler, the better game in WWF Raw in every way possible.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. So moving on. I will mention real quickly here, for the purposes for being complete, Royal Rumble is the middle game of the trilogy that came out in 1993. There's a missing link between these two games. I think Jordan and I covered this game way back when because he was a big fan of this game, at least. So. Like I said, it would have made sense to cover all three games at the time. We didn't, so we're trying to rectify that error like right now. But Raw was the first game. Raw was the last game of this trilogy. The first game of the Raw brand, which I know Joe and I talked about this before off mic before, was there were a number of games afterwards. There were a number of games afterwards that did carry the Raw name in some form before the brand was finally phased out, like later years. So this game was a big game, many systems, many improvements. It came out originally for Super NES, Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear in late 1994 for North American Europe. They later released an enhanced 32X version of the game in 1995 for North America only. So, Real-Time Associates handled ports of the handheld version. The Super NES version, Genesis version was again dubbed by Sculpture semi-conductor software. So, Joe already said he has experience with this game, so I'm not going to rehash that point. So right away with the title screen, you can see all the improvements that they made. There's a very detailed opening. The graphics look pretty bad by today's standards, but back then again when this came out, it was very impressive for sure. So, right away you can tell the improvements. This game is multi-tap compatible. So you can have up to, so I believe it's 8 players you can have up to in this game. So, and then also from the menu screen, you have several modes to pick from. 1-on-1 tag team, survival series, Royal Rumble, which is fight your way through the whole roster of people. Bedlam, Raw Endurance match, and a rematch. So right away there, you get a whole bunch of other different settings for sure, and you also can change. You also can tweak some of the options. For example, you can have one fall option turned on if you want to, which if it's enabled, characters can't do certain moves. If the referee gets knocked down, which is kind of an interesting move in and of itself, those attacks will be allowed until he recovers. But these matches cannot end until the referee is able to count pin attempts, or ring outs. And very finally, I didn't see this myself, but I did watch a video of this. If the referee gets knocked down too many times, he just after this and he walks off there.
Yes, but
he walks off the screen.
And that was one of the things I mentioned in my my notes. He'll walk off, but yet the game will still count 1, 2, 3.
Yes,
even though there's no refs. So there's that.
So yeah. It's very fun. It's very interesting. So, Bra mode. Just to go over that real quickly. The only way to win that mode is to deflate your your enemy's energy bar down to 0. There's no referees. There's no counts. So, Bedlam and Raw Endurance are interesting. Bedlam is a tag team. Joe, feel free to correct me afterwards if you think you can add on to this. I'm trying to explain this the best I can as being somebody who's pretty much a non-wrestler fan for the most part. But Bedlam's a tag. Bedlam's a mix between a tornado tag team match and elimination tag team match. So, which basically means that. You are allowed to have certain number of people, people in the ring, and the rules for how they come in and how they get eliminated are different in this, but they're a little bit over my head as exactly what conditions apply, what and when. But that's just what I got for Bedlam, the Bedlam game mode is.
Yeah. So that's kind of Bedlam to me came off as a tag team version of the Royal Rumble. So instead of the one-on-one affair that you kind of get with the Royal Rumble, you start off with 2 men on either side of the ring, so 4 men to start the match. Whereas Royal Rumble, you're going to start with 2 people, and then people come in that way. But I mean the game modes here are quite extensive compared to what we started off
for the time
with
period. 1994, it's a very good. It's a very good selection of game modes here for sure.
Yeah.
Just to cover Raw Endurance real quick. That's a mix between Survival Series, and Bedlam. You pick your first wrestler, then they can pick up to 5 more partners. You don't have to pick partners, but you can't pick up to 5 more partners. So if you want to make it really hard, you can go in by yourself, and by yourself
right.
It's 6-1 the handicap. So and whoever wins first wins. I think this is a good mode to practice wrestling mode. Practice skills with a certain wrestler, because you're forced to use him or them. You're picking one person.
Right.
In very difficult conditions, so you got to get good per se, real quick to win. So I think this is a pretty good mode to test your skills on and get better. You get better using wrestler. We'll have a pretty fun mode, because usually in past games, if you want to do that, you have to do practice, which is pretty boring and not very fun. At least this option here, I found at least to be interesting at least to play, to get good of somebody before I moved on to another mode.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you kind of touched on it, but I wanted to bring it up. Like, this game opens up legit with the Raw intro. So
Yes.
if you were watching wrestling at the time, this is exactly how the Raw broadcast would open up on USA Network. Same music, everything. They did a really good job recreating that and making it sound good. The other thing is the roster here is some would say probably not a great roster. I would argue that for this time period, this was probably the best roster you could have.
And it's the same roster in both versions of the game, yeah, Super NES Genesis. So, like,
right.
Like now, later versions of the game did have differences. Other versions of the game did have differences in the roster. We'll talk about that later on. But this version of the roster, yeah. So go ahead, Joe. It's like I think the version, I think the version's like pretty good actually. So
so we got Bret the Hitman Hart, Bam Bam Bigelow, 1-2-3 Kid, Diesel, Doink, Lex Luger, Owen Hart, Razor Ramon, Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, and Yokozuna, and then randomly they have Luna Vachon, who is the only female on the roster, and she wrestles with the dudes, obviously because there's no other females, which I know why she was included, because at the time she was kind of being billed with Bam Bam Bigelow, and they were doing some tag team stuff, and wrestling dudes. But, like, I don't know, it's kind of odd that they didn't include, at least another female wrestler, Medusa, or what's her name? Alundra Blaze is what she was called in WWF. Was, in the company at this time, so you would think they would have at least included her and had that opportunity, but not the case.
So just to mention the other differences, like real quick here, the second 32X version of the game does feature additional wrestler Quang, who's only who only be accessed like by cheat code. So because he's a cheat code wrestler only, he doesn't have his own he doesn't have his own moves. So he's just kind of like but the 30X version of the game, is kind of different, kind of interesting in its own way. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But the Game Gear version has some does not include 1-2-3 Kid, Doink the Clown, Luna or Owen Hart. It does, however, include Randy Savage, which is kind of interesting. Like big name wrestler to include is exclusive to one version of the game. So. Yeah. The Game Boy version definitely has the smallest roster for all. That only has Bret Hart, Diesel, Doink the Clown, Lex Luger, Razor, Shawn, The Undertaker, and Yokozuna. Probably again because of size of cart limitations.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like maybe the roster is not as big as the past few versions. Having Randy Savage exclusive only to the Game Gear version of the game is interesting for sure. But it's still like, I think it's still like a pretty good solid roster. But all the wrestlers have their own. All the wrestlers here have their real life finishing moves that they use at the time. Yep. And for the console version of the game, they also have mega moves that you can also use to do some like major damage. Some of them can be countered, some of them can't, depending upon the wrestler and certain move that it is. So right there you have, even though it's still the same tug of war system that the past two games had, there's much more options and things you can do in the ring with these wrestlers, which I think in turn enhances the gameplay value and makes the game like more fun to play.
Also, one of the improvements to the mechanics under the hood here, we do still have that tug of war system. We get a more detailed meter here, so you can see whether you're winning or not. So that's a plus. But also, believe it or not, there are statistics for each wrestler in this game. You have to put in a cheat code to enable you to be able to actually see what those stats are. But those stats,
yep.
those
I was cover
do
that cheat code
affect
at
the
the
game.
end. So yep. But.
Yeah, so some wrestlers are stronger, some wrestlers are faster, and it does affect not only the tug of war system, but also being able to do your mega moves and your finishers, which fantastic. Doing the mega moves and the finisher moves are done a la Mortal Kombat input style. So, you got your like back, forward, whatever, kick, punch, to do whatever. So there's definitely a lot more complexity here than what we had with Super WrestleMania and even Royal Rumble. This game, even, in my opinion, eclipsed that game.
That's high praise indeed, yeah. Graphics and music, definitely for a late Super NES game, they expect better graphics for sure. They definitely are. The graphics of this look very good. The engine's still fundamentally the same for 3 games, but the graphics have been upgraded this one. I think you like to look the best. More importantly, 4 wrestlers could be on screen at one time with no slowdown. I didn't see anything. The controls felt very smooth and tight. I didn't have any problems like that for sure. Music sound effects in this game are quite good. The one thing I did notice, however, that it seems like that probably I imagine this is probably like limitation. The limitation like about the engine being used. But all the wrestlers like are the same height. Which in reality, of course they're not. But
right.
I guess that's a limitation of the engine that they use, probably. But even the audience is like very large and detailed in your face in this game, which is like very impressive.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention it with Super WrestleMania, but like even in Super WrestleMania, you can see Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler in the back doing commentary, and like they're actually animated. Yeah. During the match, during certain moves being done. And in that game also, like Howard Finkel is in the ring and announces the matches and whatnot. And then you get the visual 1, 2, 3. Here, you still get Jerry the King Lawler and Vince McMahon doing what they do in the past 2 games. But they also included, they have like little word bubbles that kind of talk about the strengths or weaknesses of each wrestler and the type of match that they're going to be wrestling in, which I thought was a really nice touch. What was the other thing? We already talked about the referee. That was the other thing I had in my notes.
Yep.
Music. I think the music is, again, this is the best out of all 3 games.
Agreed.
On top of that, the music now plays when you're selecting your character, which is fantastic. I love it. So you selected on like a little TV. When you select the wrestler, the music's, well, even before you select the wrestler, as you scroll to the wrestler, it plays their theme music. You choose them, the match starts, you win the match, the theme music plays again, and it actually has the Titantron cycling through, the different graphics for the players.
Yep.
How do you? It's like signature art, I guess.
Right.
Would be the best way to put it. But yeah, just a lot of attention to detail to the atmosphere and the surroundings of the game. Like I said, it's still very much a button mash fest here. That really hasn't changed. You even get that in games after this, in like Warzone or WWF Attitude for like the PlayStation. Those also were by acclaim and very much had that button mashing mechanic as well. So look, man, Super WrestleMania had to walk so that Raw could sprint.
That's a good way to
what it
describe
comes
it.
down to. Yeah. And Raw is literally the culmination of 3 years of game development and tweaking. And it's pretty cool to be able to see the evolution of the game from, Super WrestleMania, your Hulk Hogan era, essentially, to what is technically with Raw, it's the new generation, which we know now in hindsight didn't really go anywhere and just made way for the Attitude Era. But, this was the time in which Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels were like the big, head of champions. They were the ones holding up the company, along with Diesel. So, I think this game, conveys that very well. And I think it's very much a product of its time, but it's also one that very well represents the product of its time.
Yeah, and I would argue that this game is definitely the best of the three, like you said. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't know if you go back to play any of these games nowadays because the wrestling games have evolved so far since then. But this definitely is the best game out of the three, and definitely, if you were going to go back, this is a good pick for sure to go back to. So, and this game reviewed pretty well too when it came out as well. But yeah, that was a very good summary, Joe. Better than I could have probably stated it myself. So thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and as far as going back and playing this game, so for the NES, I really can't sit there and say, "Oh, play this wrestling game." I can't. I think they're all bad, and I don't think any of them are worth putting time into at all. At least here, I can recommend WWF Raw. Go back. Check it out. There is, yes, there's some button mashing, but it's not all button mashing. And there is some variety that you can play and be able to enjoy. But you're absolutely correct. With the advent of, the SmackDown games in the late 1990s, 99 and 2001 to be precise, that literally changed everything. Not just the way we play video games, but the way we play wrestling video games. And then, of course, you had, No Mercy and WWF WrestleMania 2000, which, again, those stemmed from the early WCW games, which that's the whole thing. But as far as WWF games go, you could go back and you can play those PlayStation and 64 games and kind of have an enjoyment there. I think this is more of a novelty. If you are trying to go back and enjoy wrestling of this particular era, yes, this is the game to choose. But if you're just looking to play a wrestling game, I'm going to tell you, either pick up one that came out in early 2000s for the PS2 or play something recent, because the wrestling games have only gotten better.
True.
It's really hard to go back. It's kind of like football. I could recommend you playing Madden 98 or Madden 93, whatever. But more than likely, you're not going to play them because it's not what you're used to. You're used to the more modern way that Madden is played, which really started in that PS2 era and hasn't really changed since. So, I get why you would want to come back, but really there's no reason to.
Yeah. So just to cover, just to finish up here, there were a few differences. There were a few differences, like the Texas version. They were trying to convince people to spread this. They were trying to appease the poor souls who buy the system, basically, to why they should buy this version of the game instead. So they did throw a few upgrades on here. We already mentioned Quinn being here as a legacy wrestler. There's extra moves included in this version of the game. They also introduced outside weapons that you could also grab and use and use on the people. So that's fun. The referees also alternate. And the commentators alternate this version of the game. You not only have Vince and Jerry, you also sometimes have Grill Monsoon and Stephanie Weand doing the commentating instead. So, and the graphics, of course, are improved as you would expect for a 30-disc version of the game. So,
Right.
people have criticized this version of the game as having poor controls compared to the Super NES and Genesis versions, and that the AI was overly hard to beat on all but the difficulty setting for some reason in this version of the game. So, definitely some cons. To go with pros for sure. People also commented that the Super NES version of the game handled better. The controls are better and tighter in that version of the game compared to the Genesis version. So at least it looks like this time the Super NES version is superior slightly to the Genesis version. In this case, I'd argue, but not to the point where it's like a major deal breaker.
Yeah.
Next generation reviewed the Super NES version of the game, gave it like 3 out of 5 stars. Game Pro also covered it and gave it like 4 out of 5. So again, pretty good reviews that you'd expect to find the version of the game. So anyway, so I don't have anything else to say about those two games. I think Joe already did his final thoughts pretty well on this. So Super WrestleMania has no cheat codes. Raw does. Joe already mentioned the big one, how you can also both see and also change the wrestlers' stats if you want to. So you definitely can do that to tweak up your wrestler some and have some more fun with the game that way, which is also very cool for the time period. There's also code. There's also code that allows you to enable 2-punch knockout. If you want to have like a cheap way of winning, anyone to wrestle against yourself or have a clone wrestler in your team, there's another code you can also put in to duplicate a character.
Yeah.
And the last code gives you infinite lives. So which is the most simple for a code. If you have to be thrown out, just hit select.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's not much of a code, but but it is what it is. So prices, as mentioned before, WWF WrestleMania was very highly promoted, very highly hyped. The game sold very well. Easy evidence for that based upon the number of copies available online, online cheap prices that this game is sold for. One of the cheaper prices for Super NES games I've seen in a while, actually. There were a whopping 457 copies of this game listed for sale on eBay at the time to do research on this, with 113 copies of the game sold recently. Those are some high numbers. Like I said, you want proof this game so well back in the day, here it is. But very cheap prices too. Carts only sold anywhere. Carts only North America prices. And these include shipping. Carts this game sold anywhere from $720 to $728. And CIB wasn't much pricier either. $25 to $103.
Okay.
Even a sealed copy of the game sold very cheaply, for sealed prices. That's over $306, which is like a lot of things. A lot of other things are more expensive than $300 for sure. So
right.
So it's $300 plus shipping for a sealed copy of the game is pretty darn good. I'd say, but. WWF Raw, because it was a later release because it was released for multiple systems. Pricing is actually a little cheaper in most ways, but not as many copies of the game are online, which tells me the game didn't sell as many copies for several reasons. Time period came out, like I said, the game came out for multiple systems. Blah, 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 that kind of stuff. So I only found 93 copies of this game listed on eBay, 46 copies sold. I mean, still good numbers. This is still a pretty easy to find game. Just not quite as absurd with numbers as WrestleMania was. Right. And for the prices are cheaper also. Considering the fact I think this game is better, the fact this pricing is cheaper surprised me a bit, but it is what it is, I guess. $17 for carts, $20 to $83 for CIB. The sealed copy of the game, the example I could find was much more expensive, $1,260. So definitely a very expensive game to get in sealed format, but cheaper to get for cart and CIB than even the WWF WrestleMania game. And I think these prices for the games quite affordable. If you want to have a physical copy of your game for your collection or whatever, even CIB, this is like pretty good pricing. So, anyway, that's the other two games for the LJN Trilogy. They probably should have covered 6 years ago, but we're rectifying that mistake like right now. But so there are still some wrestling games left for the system, mostly Japanese games at this point, I think. So we may cover another wrestling game at some point in the future. But I think we have covered with this now. I think we have covered most of the major releases. Perhaps all of the I have to check. Perhaps all the American Super NES released games for wrestling. I think at this point.
So we have one more that we are doing this year in December, and that will be WCW Super Brawl Wrestling, which is the last major wrestling game for the system. So because that was late release, right? Like 96, I think, or something like that. But something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but okay. All right, but of course there are many more Japanese wrestling games as well too. So we made up covering like one of those at some point in the future. But next up on the podcast, we're covering. I wouldn't say it's a heavy hitter, but it still definitely is a game that people definitely have very fond memories of, and I think. And I'm curious to go back to play to see how it holds up today. We're covering the Super NES port of Konami's arcade hit Sunset Riders, which, given how great a job Konami did with their arcade ports, read the Turtles games and other stuff. I think this game, I remember this game being very fun back in the day, and I think I believe this game's still going to hold up pretty well today. So I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, I've never played this game, so
not at all.
Not the home ports. So I played the arcade. I love the arcade.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But it was butchered for the Genesis, and all the reviews back in the day pretty much kept me away from the Genesis version. And as we know, I was not a Super Nintendo kid, so I did not play it back then. And the backlog gets so big that you got to be picky and choosy of what you do play. So this will be the first time I've played the Super NES version, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, yep, definitely. Same here. So, anyway, that's it for our podcast today. As always, we appreciate you listening to us and being here with us. Questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, etc. can live at our Facebook page. You can also send me directly to the Super NES podcast the SNES podcast at yahoo.com. Let me be absolutely correct here about that. Joe, where can they reach you at?
I can still be found on Twitter at JOESUX30. Also on Twitch at JOESUX69. Man, I am on Facebook, very public page. I also have another podcast I do, the Radical Retro Roundup. We are now a bi-monthly podcast, and we are definitely not family friendly, so be careful where you listen to us. That being said, we are going to be tackling Juiced, which was a Need for Speed Underground type racing game.
Right, I remember us talking about that last time.
Yeah. So, you know me and how I'm a procrastinator. I still have not played the game, so there's that. And then, as Greg and I were discussing before we started recording, I also got Lunar Remastered. So I'm really dragging my heels because I got that to play as well. So, it's going to be fun when we finally do record that episode towards the middle of May.
Right. Okay. Sounds good. All right, everybody. As always, thank you for joining us. Joe, as always, thank you for podcasting with me.
Of course.
Stay safe, everybody. Be well, and we'll catch you again later. Take care, all.
Bye.
Nintendo controls 80% of the video market. But no matter how you play the game, or which game you play, things definitely have come a long way since Pac-Man.
Now you're playing with power. Super power.